This video is about applying for small grants. Now, obviously, whenever applying for any type of grant, there's a bunch of tips and tricks that apply. But there are also specific tips and tricks that particularly apply for certain types of grants. And this video is all about applying for small grants. So what types of small grant schemes are there? Well, there's two main categories. The first is some form of internally run small grant scheme, typically run within a research organization like a university. The second is a type of pilot study scheme run by an external funding body. One of the key principles to remember when thinking about applying for small grants is that many small grant schemes are gateways to bigger and better things. And so while the grant itself has to deliver some sort of outcomes, really often their primary purpose is to enable you to prove or disprove or do the initial due diligence on what would be a much larger body of research in future. Small grant schemes, especially the ones run internally at a university, often serve a significant training and development purpose, at least for early career researchers and potentially even PhD students. They give relatively inexperienced researchers the chance to learn how to apply for, manage, and fulfill the outcomes on a body of funded research that they lead themselves, as opposed to primarily working on research funded through their principal investigator or lab head. For the internal small grant schemes, they are a gateway to bigger and better things in terms of future grant applications. Sometimes they can also be the first step of a larger internally funded research initiative like a research center or a research group. Small grant schemes that are run externally are very common in areas like philanthropic and community-based research. Some of these schemes exist entirely for their own purpose. They're not a gateway to anything else. But once again, often these small pilot scheme grants are a first step towards a larger program of funded research. Generally speaking, applying for a small grant should be a substantially cut down process from what you would have to do for a full grant. No one wants you to spend huge amounts of time applying for a relatively small amount of money. And if the small grant scheme's purpose is primarily developmental, once again, it's not meant to kill you with the amount of effort that you spend applying for it. It's meant to be a learning experience. So while cut down, often these grant application structures will be very similar to a cut down version of a full grant proposal. So you might have an abstract or summary statement followed by a significance in innovation section, an approach and methodology section, a feasibility benefit section. Who benefits from this? Is it the research community, industry, government, the general public, and a list of references. There'll also typically be a budget. Obviously, this won't usually be a multi-million-dollar budget like for a larger grant, but once again, often this is to give you practice in doing realistic budgeting for funding research. Where the purpose of the grant scheme has a significant training and development aspect, there may be additional sections you have to fill out. One would be how the proposed program of research aligns with your career development goals and your career vision. One would be whether you have support from your line managers and supervisors to do this grant on top of all the things that are keeping you busy already. If it's a highly collaborative grant or it involves collaborations between research and industry, you might also have lightweight letters or emails of support from those partners that indicate that they're interested in you pursuing this program of research. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there are common principles in terms of writing effective and compelling grants. The tough question that we have to get through right up front is the question which goes like this. If this is so important and urgent, why hasn't someone already solved it? And this is a question you should be able to answer compellingly for all of your grant and funding applications. There's a bunch of good typical answers to this question and also a bunch of bad answers. Some of the good answers include that the right tools and methods and techniques and equipment have only just come along, and so now the time is right to attack this problem, whereas it wasn't in the past. Another good answer to this is that the problem you're addressing is a new and rapidly emerging and rapidly growing problem. It wasn't on anyone's radar even 5 or 10 years ago, but now it's becoming critically important, and so now is the time to attack it. Another argument is that you've received all the training, whether you're a multidisciplinary researcher or you have a specific set of relatively unique skills, and that you are relatively uniquely positioned to attack this program of research, whereas many others are not. Related to this argument, you can also make the case that the working environment, the labs, the equipment, the lab group you're in is world-class and particularly well suited to attack this problem, and that you will benefit from this support and this ecosystem when you take on this project. Things you should most definitely not say in motivating why you're applying for this small research grant. One, that companies aren't really interested in funding this research. A large part of many of these grant schemes is to give you a foothold into then establishing better links with industry so industry can fund your research. This would set off a red flag. The same going for research bodies are not willing to fund this research. While it is possible that you are genuinely pioneering a brand new area of research and that no one else has seen what you've seen, at the early career stage, you have to risk mitigate this somewhat. The university funding you will want to know that there's a realistic chance of you getting bigger and longer term pots of money to fund this research if they fund you for this small research grant. When you're crafting the research problem or the program of research that you would tackle as part of this grant, it's important to be very specific and relatively narrow. You have limited resources. It's a small grant scheme, not a massive multi-million-dollar, many-year project. You have limited time to get it done. Often these grants run for 6, 12, or 18 months. And thirdly, typically these small grants are being done on top of all of your other duties. And so it's not as if you're devoted 100% of the time to this, so the goals have to be appropriate to that reality. In terms of being specific, let's say you're proposing that you're going to generate a new data set for the community. What is the point of that data set? What requirement does that data set fill that isn't already met by the existing data sets in the community? If it does meet a requirement, why hasn't someone done it before, and how are you well positioned to do it for the first time? Let's say you're proposing a new and innovative drone navigation system. Once again, the key question comes up. There are lots of very well-funded, very well-talented or filled with great talent drone companies in the world. Why have they not solved this problem beforehand? Is it because they don't care and hence it's maybe not a good research topic? Or is it because it's too hard? Can you say why you're in a good position to address this need where these other bodies and organizations have not been able to? So we've established that having a realistic and grounded proposal is very important given your limited resources and time. At the same time, you don't want the proposal to be too mundane and unexciting, and so you should link this specific, fairly narrow program of research into your grand, exciting vision of where you see your research career going and explain how it fits into that bigger picture. On a practical note, the people evaluating these small grant proposals will often be interested in what specifically this might enable you to do in a future grant application. And so imagine you're writing a much bigger grant proposal in 2 years' time. What specifically are you going to be able to say in that application that was enabled by this small grant? Were you able to grab a new unique data set that proved that this bigger proposed program of research was promising? Were you able to do some pilot testing on a new method or a new technique or some new equipment that laid the foundation for this much grander program of research in this bigger future proposal? Although a small project or small grant doesn't have a huge scope, it should still typically have concrete proposed outcomes. If it's a research-focused grant, these will often be one or more papers, but there could be other artifacts, a white paper, a policy report, a set of field trials. The more concrete and specific you can make these, the better. You should also be able to answer the question, especially if you get asked about it, of how you would determine whether the grant ends up being a success or not. If you can't measure to some degree the outcomes of the grant, then you're going to jeopardize your chance to get it in the first place. For those of you applying for small grants that would add to your already substantial workload, say as a normal postdoc on an existing project funded by your PI, you need to answer the feasibility question. So how are you going to do a good job of this project on top of all your normal duties? Some of the best answers to this are that you have an undergraduate student already lined up who's super keen to do the research and has the skills to do so, or you have a research assistant all lined up to do the same thing. Another way to risk mitigate the small grant proposal is to show that you've already done some of the preliminary work that shows that the proposal, or what you're saying you'll do in the proposal, actually has a decent chance of being successful. One key issue that you should read very carefully the grant guidelines for is whether the small grant should be very closely aligned to what you are already doing in your normal day job, or whether it should be deliberately separated and quite distinct. And you'll see grant schemes of both varieties during your career. For context, if the small grant scheme says that the program of research has to be clearly distinct and different from what you're already doing on your main job, there are concerns behind that. For example, people may have concerns about intellectual property, there may be conflict of interest concerns, or there may be concerns about appearing to have duplication of funding. And hence those concerns would motivate why they would specify that the program be distinctly different from what you're already doing. If the grant proposal scheme says that what you're proposing should be closely aligned to what you're already doing on your main project or main projects, there are a number of reasons why this decision may have been made as well. The first is risk mitigation. If it's similar to what you're already doing, the grant proposal committee knows that you're already pretty experienced at this and pretty effective at it. They also know that if it's similar work, that you can potentially leverage the substantial resources, whether it be equipment, the intellectual environment that you're already immersed in, to help you with this small proposal. When planning longer term programs of research, for example, a PhD or a much larger multi-year grant, people will talk a lot about having plan Bs, plan Cs, and being agile. With a small grant, you don't really have the luxury of being able to change course or pivot several times. You really need to get it right pretty much from the initial proposal, because you'll just run out of time and resources if you have to change course. In terms of unique opportunities that small grant schemes, especially internal small grant schemes, offer, one is the opportunity for much more extensive interaction with the people who are assessing you. So instead of just getting an accept or a reject decision from an external funding body, sometimes with very little actual feedback, you can potentially go and talk with the people who made the decision and get really frank and detailed feedback about why you didn't get the proposal and what you could do better next time. Becoming comfortable with applying for, running, and fulfilling deliverables on small grants is a very useful skill and experience set to pick up. You might be tempted to think that this is something you would only do at an early career stage, and then as you become more senior, all you'll be doing is very large grants. The reality is your funding portfolio will always involve a mixture of large initiatives and much smaller pilot projects and small grant type schemes. And so you'll always be involved in the small grant space, and becoming comfortable in operating within it is a very vital career skill to learn. When you look back at your career and examine what was the sort of most effective bang for buck projects that you've done, you'll probably be surprised that while you were happy with some of your much larger projects, there are likely going to be one or two what we would call small grant schemes with a relatively small amount of money where you did the really pivotal foundational work for your career.